in the cold gray expanse of the North Atlantic. The war was not fought in trenches or on beaches, but in a deadly calculated game of cat and mouse. Here, the hunter was the German U-boat, a silent predator that stalked the vital Allied convoys carrying food, fuel, and soldiers from North America to Great Britain. In the early years of the war, these U-boat wolf packs were masters of their domain, sinking ships with horrifying efficiency and threatening to starve Britain into submission. Their success was built on a foundation of seemingly perfect secrecy, coordinated by Admiral Karl Dönitz from a command bunker in France. The wolf packs received their orders via encrypted radio messages, a complex cipher that was, to the Allies, an impenetrable wall of gibberish. This wall was built by a machine, an electromechanical marvel of rotors, plugs, and wires known as the Enigma. To the German High Command, the Enigma code was more than just a cipher. It was a guarantee of invincibility. They believed, with absolute certainty, that it was mathematically unbreakable. They were wrong, and the story of how the Allies shattered this belief is not one of bombs and bullets, but of brilliant minds, daring captures on the high seas. This wall was built by a machine and an intellectual battle that would become the single most important intelligence victory of the entire war. This is the story of how the hunt for the Enigma machine turned the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. The Enigma machine itself was a marvel of German engineering, a testament to a nation that prided itself on precision and complexity. Looking like a fortified typewriter, its operation was deceptively simple. An operator would type a plain-text letter, and through a series of electrical pathways, a different letter would light up on a lamp board, producing the encrypted text. The genius of the machine lay in its randomization. This was achieved through a set of 3 to 5 rotating wheels, or rotors, each containing 26 electrical contacts on each side, one for every letter of the alphabet. As the operator typed, the rotors would turn in a complex, odometer-like sequence. Each key press would create a new, unique electrical circuit through the rotors, scrambling the letter. To add another layer of complexity, a plug board at the front of the machine allowed the operator to swap pairs of letters before the signal even entered the rotor system. The result was a cipher of astronomical complexity. The number of possible starting configurations for a 3-rotor Enigma machine was in the trillions. To an outside observer, a message encrypted with an Enigma machine was statistically indistinguishable from random noise. The only way to decrypt the message was to have another Enigma machine set up in the exact same starting configuration as the one that sent it. For the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, security was paramount. They used a far more complex version of the Enigma than the German Army or Air Force. Their M3 and later M4 Enigma machines had a wider selection of rotors to choose from, adding yet another layer of complexity. Each day, the settings were changed, the specific rotors to be used, the order they were to be placed in the machine, the initial rotational setting of each rotor, and the plug board connections were all dictated by a monthly codebook. A U-boat at sea would receive its orders, set its Enigma machine to the key of the day, and decrypt the message. Without that codebook, the Allies were deaf and blind. They could hear the U-boats chattering to each other and to command, their intercepts filling the airwaves, but they had no idea what was being said. They could only watch in horror as their ships vanished beneath the waves, torpedoed by wolf packs that seemed to possess a supernatural ability to be in the right place at the right time. The Allied effort to break this code was centered in a most unlikely place, a sprawling Victorian country mansion in the rolling English countryside, a place called Bletchley Park, officially known as Station X. This top-secret facility was home to a motley collection of Britain's brightest minds. They were not soldiers, but mathematicians, chess grandmasters, linguists, and classic scholars. Among them was a brilliant, eccentric Cambridge mathematician named Alan Turing, a man who would become the intellectual heart of the fight against Enigma. The early work at Bletchley Park was built upon a crucial pre-war gift from the Polish Cipher Bureau. Polish mathematicians had managed to reverse engineer a German army Enigma and had developed early techniques for breaking its codes. Just before the invasion of Poland in 1939, they shared all of their research with the British and French. This Polish contribution was the critical foundation upon which Bletchley Park would build its empire of code-breaking. However, the naval Enigma, with its greater complexity, remained a far tougher nut to crack. Turing and his colleagues realized they couldn't break it through pure mathematics alone. The possible combinations were simply too vast for any human to work through. They needed a shortcut. They needed a crib. A piece of plain text that they suspected was in the ciphertext. U-boat messages were highly formulaic. They often began with the same phrases, included standardized weather reports, or even ended with the signature, Heil Hitler. If the codebreakers could guess a likely phrase, they could use it to search for patterns in the encrypted message. This would give them a tiny foothold, a starting point to begin unraveling the day's key. To exploit these cribs, Turing designed an electromechanical machine of his own, a massive, clattering device called the bombe. The bombe was, in essence, dozens of Enigma machines wired together, and it could test thousands of possible Enigma settings per minute, searching for a logical contradiction that would reveal a piece of the daily key. It was a brute force weapon in a war of intellect. But even with the bombe, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park were still missing a crucial piece of the puzzle: the Enigma's internal wiring and, most importantly, the monthly codebooks that dictated the daily settings. They could break a day's code, but it was an agonizingly slow process. By the time they succeeded, the intelligence was often hours or even days old, too late to save the convoys being stalked by the wolf packs. To win the Battle of the Atlantic, they couldn't just break Enigma. They needed to break it in real time, and to do that, they needed to get their hands on the machine itself. The hunt was on. The urgent need for physical Enigma material led the British Admiralty to authorize a series of daring and incredibly risky operations, codenamed pinches. The idea was simple in theory, but ferociously difficult in practice: to board a German vessel before it sank and seize its Enigma machine and, more importantly, its associated codebooks. The primary targets were the lightly armed German weather ships that patrolled the frigid waters between Iceland and Norway. These ships were crucial for providing the Kriegsmarine with the meteorological data needed for U-boat operations, and each one carried an Enigma machine. The first significant success came in March 1941 during the Lofoten Islands raid in Norway. A British commando force, during their main assault, managed to corner the German armed trawler Krebs. As the British destroyer HMS Somali bore down on them, the German crew began desperately trying to destroy their sensitive equipment. They managed to throw their Enigma machine overboard, but in the chaos, they failed to destroy everything. The British boarding party scrambled onto the deck of the sinking trawler and, in a frantic search, recovered a full set of Enigma rotors and, crucially, operational documents and key setting sheets for the month of February. When these captured materials arrived at Bletchley Park, they provided the codebreakers with their first concrete look at the internal wiring of the naval rotors. It was a vital piece of the puzzle, but it was not the complete solution. They still needed a current codebook to make their breakthroughs timely. The pinches continued, with incremental successes, but the grand prize, a complete, current Enigma package from a U-boat, remained elusive. That all changed on May 9, 1941, in a dramatic encounter in the storm-tossed waters south of Iceland. The outbound convoy, OB-318, a sprawling collection of 38 merchant ships, was being stalked by a wolf pack. The convoy's escort group, under the command of Commander Joe Baker Creswell, was fighting a desperate battle. Among the hunters was U-1110, commanded by one of Germany's most celebrated U-boat aces, Fritz Julius Lemp. Lemp had achieved fame at the very beginning of the war for sinking the passenger liner SS Athenia, and he was a skilled and aggressive commander. He had already torpedoed 2 Allied ships that morning and was maneuvering for another attack. As U-1110 rose to periscope depth to line up a shot, a sonar operator on the British corvette HMS Obriesha got a clear contact. The game was up. The Obriesha raced towards the submerged U-boat's position, and dropped a pattern of depth charges. The explosions were brutally close, hammering the hull of U-1110, shattering light bulbs, and throwing the crew from their feet. A moment later, the destroyer HMS Bulldog joined the attack, dropping another, even more accurate, pattern. Inside the U-boat, the scene was one of pure chaos and terror. The lights went out, seawater began spraying from ruptured pipes, and the air filled with the acrid smell of burning electrical insulation. Lemp, believing his boat was mortally wounded and sinking fast, made a fateful decision. He ordered the boat to the surface and screamed the command to abandon ship. As U-110 broke the waves, its crew scrambled from the hatches, expecting the British ships to riddle their boat with gunfire. Lemp, realizing he had not given the order to properly destroy the Enigma and its secret documents, allegedly tried to swim back to the U-boat but vanished beneath the waves, either shot by the British or drowned. The British ships, seeing the crew abandon the submarine, held their fire. Commander Baker Cresswell on the bridge of the Bulldog watched as the U-boat, instead of sinking, remained stubbornly afloat, bobbing in the Atlantic swell. A thought, an audacious, almost unthinkable idea sparked in his mind. He turned to his navigating officer and gave an order that would change the course of the war. "I'm going to put a boarding party across." A young sub-lieutenant named David Baum was tasked with leading the boarding party. As his small whaleboat bounced across the waves towards the abandoned German submarine, he and his men had no idea what to expect. The U-boat could be booby-trapped, or it could sink from under them at any moment. As they clambered onto the U-boat's deck and descended through the conning tower hatch, they were met with an eerie silence. The lights were still out, the deck was slick with oil and seawater, and the smell of diesel was overpowering. A solitary alarm bell was still ringing. As their eyes adjusted to the gloom, they began their search. And then, in the radio room, they found it. The Holy Grail. An Enigma machine, complete and intact, was bolted to the table. Beside it, as if left out for their inspection, were the codebooks, key-setting procedures, and the bigram tables used for encryption. It was the entire secret of the German naval Enigma, laid bare. The boarding party worked frantically, passing the machine, the books, and every scrap of paper they could find up to the deck and into their boat. The intelligence windfall was almost too vast to comprehend. They had not only captured a machine, but the code books for June, which were currently in use, as well as all the supporting documents needed to understand the entire cipher system. The British Admiralty immediately understood the supreme importance of this capture. Secrecy was now the most critical weapon. The Germans could not, under any circumstances, know that UA-110 and its secrets had been compromised. If they did, they would change the entire Enigma system overnight, and the prize would be worthless. An elaborate deception was put into action. The crew of the Bulldog and the other escort ships were sworn to absolute secrecy, forbidden from ever speaking of what they had seen. The captured German sailors were isolated and interrogated in a way that would prevent them from communicating with any new prisoners, and the U-boat itself, U-1110, was taken under tow, but the British deliberately allowed it to sink before it reached port, creating the official story that it had foundered at sea. To the German High Command, U-1110 had simply vanished, presumed lost with all hands to a successful depth charge attack. They had no reason to suspect their unbreakable code had been broken. When the captured material arrived at Bletchley Park, it was like a lightning strike. Alan Turing and his team of Codebreakers now had everything they had dreamed of. They had a complete machine, which confirmed the internal wiring of the rotors. They had the codebooks, which gave them the daily keys. They could now calibrate their bombs with perfect information. The wall of German naval secrecy was about to come crashing down. The intellectual battle was over. The slaughter of the wolf packs was about to begin. The arrival of the captured materials from U-1110 at Bletchley Park was a moment of quiet, earth-shattering triumph. Inside Hut 8, the section dedicated to breaking the naval Enigma, the atmosphere was electric. Alan Turing and his team of brilliant, eccentric codebreakers now possessed the keys to the kingdom. They had a complete, wired Enigma machine which confirmed all their theoretical assumptions. They had the current code books, which gave them the daily rotor and plugboard settings, and they had the bigram tables, which were the final piece of the complex decryption puzzle. The formidable wall of German naval secrecy had been comprehensively breached. The intelligence derived from these Enigma decrypts was given the highest possible security classification, Ultra. Access to Ultra intelligence was restricted to a tiny handful of individuals, including Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who would receive the decrypts in a special locked box every morning. The information was so sensitive that it could never be acted upon directly in a way that might arouse German suspicion. A convoy could not be told. A U-boat is at this exact location, because the Germans would immediately wonder how they knew. Instead, the intelligence had to be laundered. A cover story was always created. A patrol aircraft would be, coincidentally, sent to the U-boat's location, and the official report would state that the U-boat was found by routine aerial reconnaissance. This meticulous secrecy was vital to keeping the Golden Goose alive. With the U-1 on den materials, the speed of decryption at Bletchley Park increased exponentially. What had once taken days or even weeks of painstaking work on the bombs could now be achieved in a matter of hours. For the first time, the intelligence was not historical. It was operational. The Admiralty's Operational Intelligence Center, or OIC, became the nerve center of the Battle of the Atlantic. In a locked room deep beneath the Admiralty building in London, a team led by a brilliant, partially disabled barrister named Roger Wynne worked around the clock in what was known as the submarine tracking room. On a colossal map of the Atlantic Ocean, Wynne's team used the constant stream of ultra decrypts to plot the precise, real-time location of every single U-boat at sea. They knew the U-boat's patrol orders, their fuel and torpedo status, and their intended rendezvous points. The primary use of this godlike knowledge was defensive. Convoys, the lifeblood of Britain, could now be carefully routed through gaps in the German patrol lines. For the U-boat crews, the experience was maddening. They would arrive at their assigned patrol areas, often after a long and arduous journey, only to find empty seas. The vast convoys they were sent to intercept seemed to vanish into thin air. The impact was immediate and dramatic. In the months following the capture of U-1110, Allied shipping losses in the Atlantic plummeted. At the same time, U-boat losses began to climb. Ultra-intelligence also allowed for offensive operations. The OIC could now identify and target the Germans' crucial U-boat supply vessels, the milch cows. These large, vulnerable submarines were tasked with refueling and rearming the combat U-boats at sea, allowing them to extend their patrols. With Ultra, the Royal Navy's hunter-killer groups could be vectored directly to the milch cows' secret rendezvous points. The destruction of these supply boats was a devastating blow, forcing the combat U-boats to cut their patrols short and return to their bases in France, drastically reducing the number of predators. In the Atlantic hunting grounds. From the German perspective at the U-boat command headquarters in Lorient, the situation was becoming baffling. Their top aces were being lost at an alarming rate. Their most carefully planned wolfpack operations were failing. Admiral Durnance was convinced there was a security breach. He suspected British espionage, new Allied radar technology, or even treachery within his own ranks. But he and the entire German High Command refused to believe the one thing that was actually true, that their precious, unbreakable Enigma had been compromised. Their faith in their machine was so absolute that it had become a form of dogma, a critical blind spot that the Allies mercilessly exploited. This golden age of decryption, however, was not to last. The Germans, while never suspecting Enigma itself was broken, were not idle. They were constantly looking for ways to improve their communications security. On February 1, 1942, the Kriegsmarine introduced a new, far more complex Enigma machine for its Atlantic U-boat fleet, the M4, or four-rotor Enigma. This new machine introduced a fourth rotor into the scrambling process, increasing the mathematical complexity by a factor of 26. To the Codebreakers at Bletchley Park, the effect was catastrophic. The new U-boat cipher, which they codenamed Shark, was completely unreadable. Suddenly, they were blind. The constant stream of ultra-intelligence that had been the key to their success dried up overnight. This period, which lasted for 10 agonizing months, became known as the Shark Blackout. The consequences were immediate and horrific. Without the ability to route convoys away from the wolf packs, Allied shipping losses soared to their highest levels of the war. For the German U-boat crews, it was the second happy time. They once again roamed the Atlantic with impunity, sinking ships at will, particularly off the poorly defended American East Coast. The fate of the war once again hung in the balance. Inside Hut 8, the pressure was immense. Turing and his team worked frantically, developing new theories and designing new, more powerful bombs to tackle the four-rotor problem. But they knew that theory alone would not be enough. To break Shark, they needed another pinch. They needed to get their hands on an M4 Enigma machine and its codebooks. The hunt, which they thought had ended with U-11 Seg, was on once again. The 10-month Shark Blackout, from February to December of 1942, was one of the darkest periods of the war for the Allies. With Bletchley Park rendered blind, the U-boat wolf packs rampaged across the Atlantic, sinking ships at a rate that threatened to sever Britain's lifeline to the United States. The convoy routes became a slaughterhouse. Inside Hut 8, Alan Turing and his team worked with a desperate intensity, building faster, more powerful bombs, and exploring every mathematical possibility to crack the new four-rotor Enigma. But they were fighting a ghost. Without a key, without a glimpse inside the new machine, they were lost in a wilderness of trillions upon trillions of possibilities. The order went out once again to every ship in the Royal Navy. A pinch was needed, now more than ever. The fate of the war could depend on it. The breakthrough came not in the cold North Atlantic, but in the warm, clear waters of the Eastern Mediterranean. On October 30th, 1942, the British destroyer HMS Petard, while hunting for a U-boat that had attacked a convoy near Port Said, Egypt, gained a firm sonar contact. The target was U-559. For the next 16 hours, the Petard and its fellow destroyers relentlessly hunted the submarine, dropping pattern after pattern of depth charges. Inside U-559, the situation was hellish. The repeated concussions ruptured pipes, knocked out the lights, and sent the submarine plunging out of control. The commander, Captain Lieutenant Hans Heidmann, fought desperately to save his boat, but it was a losing battle. Crippled and taking on water, he was forced to make the agonizing decision to surface and abandon ship. As U-559 broke the waves in the bright Mediterranean moonlight, the crew scrambled out, expecting to be met with a hail of gunfire. But the commander of the Petard, Lieutenant Commander Mark Thornton, gave the order to hold fire. Seeing the U-boat was not immediately sinking, he saw his chance. He dispatched a boarding party. What followed was an act of almost unbelievable courage. Two men, First Lieutenant Tony Fasson and able seaman Colin Grazier, stripped off their outer clothing and plunged into the sea, swimming to the crippled U-boat. They were joined by a 16-year-old canteen assistant, Tommy Brown, who had lied about his age to join the Navy, and who followed them onto the submarine's deck. Fasson and Grazier descended through the conning tower into the dark, flooding interior of the U-boat. Water was already up to their waists and rising fast. Working by the dim light of a torch, they found the Enigma's codebooks and other crucial documents. They knew they had only seconds. They passed the heavy, waterlogged books up through the hatches to Tommy Brown, who was waiting on the casing. They made multiple trips into the dark, treacherous hull, passing up every secret they could find. They had just passed up the final set of documents when a crewman from the Petard yelled a warning. "You'll have to come out of it, the submarine is sinking." But it was too late. With a final rush of air and a groan of tortured metal, U-559 plunged beneath the waves, taking Lieutenant Fasson and able seaman Grazier with it. They had sacrificed their lives for the intelligence they had just secured. The documents they saved passed from their dying hands to a teenage boy on the deck of a sinking enemy submarine were the keys that would unlock the Shark cipher. When they arrived at Bletchley Park, the Codebreakers found what they were looking for, the Short Signal Codebook and the Weather Short Signal Codebook. These books provided the crucial cribs, the snippets of plain text, that allowed Turing's team to finally deduce the wiring of the new fourth rotor and the settings for the M4 Enigma. By mid-December 1942, the new, faster bombs were calibrated, and Bletchley Park began to, once again, read the U-boat signals in real time. The 10-month blackout was over. The effect was immediate and decisive. The spring of 1943 saw the climax of the Battle of the Atlantic, now armed with perfect ultra-intelligence and equipped with new technologies like long-range B-24 Liberator bombers that could patrol the mid-Atlantic gap, centimetric radar that could spot a surfaced U-boat from miles away, and new escort carriers. The Allies went on the offensive. The hunters became the hunted. The month of May 1943 became known to the Germans as Black May. In that single month, Admiral Dönitz lost 41 U-boats, a catastrophic and unsustainable rate of attrition. His Wolfpack strategy had been shattered. On May 24, 1943, a deeply shaken Dönitz was forced to withdraw most of his U-boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest and arguably most important campaign of the war, had been won. The legacy of the Enigma intelligence is almost impossible to overstate. Historians widely agree that ultra-intelligence shortened the war by at least 2 years, and possibly more. By allowing the Allies to win the Battle of the Atlantic, it ensured the flow of men and material needed for the D-Day landings in Normandy. It saved hundreds of Allied ships and tens of thousands of lives. It provided crucial intelligence for nearly every major land and sea battle of the European war. Yet, for decades after the war, the story remained one of the most closely guarded secrets in history. The Official Secrets Act bound all Bletchley Park personnel to a lifetime of silence, the heroes of this intellectual war. The brilliant, tragic Alan Turing, who would be persecuted for his homosexuality after the war. The thousands of men and women who worked in anonymity at Station X, and the sailors like Tony Fasson, Colin Grazier, and Tommy Brown who gave their lives to secure the vital intelligence, received no public recognition. Their story was a blank page in the history books. It was only in the 1970s, when the first books about Ultra began to be published, that the world finally learned of the incredible secret war of wits that had been waged in the English countryside. It was a war fought not with tanks or battleships, but with intellect, perseverance, and incredible courage. It was a war that proved that the most powerful weapon is not always the one that makes the loudest noise, but the one that allows you to hear the secrets of your enemy.